Hello again, guys. This is the screencast for the first acquisition of skill lesson, and it talks about the different classifications of skill that you'll be required to know for your forthcoming initial exam and also your final exam, obviously. Okay, to start with, what we need to do is to classify our movement skills. What that means is for every skill that you could do in sport, there will be a way of putting it into a box or a specific named movement. And the reason educators or coaches or sports scientists do this is so they can work out what type of coaching practice or teaching style could be used to deliver that particular movement skill. So say if you were learning weightlifting, you'd need to classify what sort of skill weightlifting was in order to work out how to coach weightlifting effectively for an individual or a group of individuals. So the way we do this is we classify these skills into 6 different areas, and these are as follows. What we call a gross fine classification, which is to do with muscular involvement. The second one is what we call an open closed classification, which is to do with the environment. Third one is what we call a discrete serial continuous classification, which is to do with continuity. Fourth is self-paced to externally paced classification, which is to do with pacing. Fifth is a simple complex classification to do with difficulty. And finally we have a low to high classification, which is to do with organisational properties. So if we start off with the muscular involvement continuum, and what a continuum is actually a line which has 2 ends, and as you can see from the arrows, the 2 ends, and at one end will be one end of a spectrum and the other end will be another end of the spectrum, and you usually classify a skill into either one end or the other, or sometimes it could be anywhere along that line. So for example, it might not necessarily fit into one of these 2 boxes. It might be somewhere in between or nearer to one side than the other. That's what we call continuum. So in this muscular involvement continuum you have 2 categories. You have what's called a gross muscle movement. So these are skills which use large muscle groups and they require lots of movement. So any sort of skill that has that sort of specification, if you like, will be categorized as a gross muscle movement. A good example of a gross muscle movement is weightlifting. At the other end of the spectrum you have a fine muscle movement, so it's just opposites in this spectrum. So as you can probably guess, this involves small muscle groups and very intricate or fine detail movement. And a good example of this is darts. So at one end of the spectrum you have a skill of darts, the other one is a skill of weightlifting. You might think, well, let's think of a random skill such as shooting a basketball free throw. Well, that has some fine tendencies as well as gross muscle movement, because you're using a lot of muscles in your arm and your legs, which are the bigger muscle groups, but your fingers actually make spin on the ball. So it might be that you think basketball shooting would be somewhere along the middle of this line rather than it's a gross skill or a fine skill, and that's how this works. Okay, the second continuum is the environmental influence continuum, and on one side we have what's called open skills. Now these skills are affected by the environment. What we mean by the environment is not just wind and weather, but also are there lots of opponents moving around, are there lots of decisions to be made, and these skills involve effective decision making as well. Good examples of this are a pass in rugby. So in rugby you've got lots of things going on at the same time. It's an open environment, lots of decisions to be made. On the opposite end of the spectrum you have a closed skill continuum. These things are not affected by the environment, so weather or opponents or anything else would not affect what you're doing as a skill. Usually it's self-paced, so you do it in your own time. A very good example of this is a free throw in basketball. You can start the free throw whenever you like. It's not affected by any other players. It's you, the ball and the net. They're all the same distance. They're always the same. Third, you have the continuity continuum. Now this one has 3 aspects to it. You have what's called discrete skills. So these are skills that you have a clear beginning, middle and end. You can see where it starts, see the middle of it, you can see the end of it. if you wanted to do that skill again, you'd have to start that process all over again from the beginning point. Good example of that is a golf swing. You see the start, you see the middle, you see the end, put the ball down, you have to start the skill again to repeat it. Middle section of this continuum is called a serial skill. This is where you have lots of discrete skills put together in a set order to make a sequence. A good example of that is gymnastics. You have lots of different skills put together. Finally, you have a continuous skill. These are skills you can't clearly see the beginning, middle or end, and sometimes they loop round again and again and again, and the end of one cycle is the beginning of the next. A good example of this is cycling. So where you're moving your legs to rotate the bike, there's nowhere where you say, well, actually you start at this point and you end at this point. It's all one continuous loop. Same with running, same with swimming. Pacing continuum is the fourth continuum, and this is where we have either self-paced skills, whereby a performer chooses when the movement can start, so you pace it yourself. Usually it's what we call a closed skill, so we talked about these earlier on. So a closed skill is not affected by the environment, you do it in your own time, usually the same sort of distances and environment setup. A good example of this is a tennis serve. So you choose when to start the movement, you serve, it's a closed skill. Opposite to that is externally paced, so the environment affects this one a little bit more, and you are not in control of when it starts. That's the most important thing. As I say, it's usually an open skill, so it usually is affected by the environment, so the environment might affect when you start your movement. Good example of this is windsurfing. You might have to wait for the wind to be effective before you can actually set sail somewhere or perform some sort of surfing technique, as this picture shows. Fifth one is the difficulty continuum, and here we have either simple skills or complex ones, but simple skills to start with. In simple skills, there is small information to process. There's not a lot of thinking going on. It's a very easy skill to do. Usually you don't have to make many decisions, usually one or two decisions at the very most in simple skills, and a good example of that is running. I don't really have to decide much to actually do the action of running. I'm just putting one leg in front of the other and moving my arms. Okay, very simple skill. Swimming is the same, cycling is the same. Simple skills, very few decisions to make. Complex skills are the opposite. You need lots of decisions required, large amounts of information to process through your brain. Example of this is a diving routine or a somersault. Lots of complex requirements there as to when to turn, when do I pull my legs into my body. Lots of information to process in your brain. And finally we have the organisational continuum. This is the most difficult one to understand, and lots of people get confused with this, so be careful. Okay, we have what's called a low organised skill, and these skills are skills you can see different parts of quite easily. So if you watch the skill, you can say, right, that's part 1, that's part 2, that's part 3, and I can separate those parts and practice them on my own. Great example of this is tennis serve. Although it is one whole movement, the tennis serve, one skill, you can see you have the ball toss, the racket bit goes back, forward swing, and then you have a follow through. So those parts can be separated and practiced on their own. The opposite to this is what we call high organisation skills. Now these skills are very, very difficult to see separate parts or to break them down. So the H in high organisation stands for hard to spot the parts. And often these skills you've got to perform them in one go. You can't separate them. Like a tennis serve, I could separate that up. You've got to hit this in one go and might require specialist equipment. A great example of this is a 360-degree spin in snowboarding or a somersault. You've got to do that skill in one whole movement for it to be effective. Okay, as with all our screencasts, if you go back over what we've talked about, make good notes because you need to bring them to the lesson, and then we're going to perform some sort of practical activity to show different classifications of skills and to see if you can identify different ones as well.